want to look at some of her religious painting. This is pretty well known because it is in the Uffizi in Florence. It's a noli me tangere. Now, noli me tangere means touch me not. So this is a quote from the Latin Bible. And it is the words that Christ spoke to Mary Magdalene after the resurrection. Noli me tangere, which means touch me not, are the words that Christ spoke to Mary Magdalene after the resurrection. Now, after Christ died on the cross, he had to be very quickly placed in the tomb because sunset was approaching, and under Jewish law you could not bury bodies during the Sabbath. So from sunset Friday to sunset Saturday would be the Sabbath day in Judaism. And then on the morning after the Sabbath, which would be Sunday morning, some of the holy women, the Marys, come to the tomb, and you can see this in the middle ground here in the sort of upper left, and they find the tomb empty. They find an angel there, and the angel tells them that that Christ has risen. The scene below, the main scene, the Noli me tangere scene, is from the Gospel of St. John. And in it, Mary Magdalene goes to anoint the body of Christ. They didn't have time on Friday night to do it. And so she goes to the tomb, she finds it open, she finds the tomb missing, evidently the angel isn't there at that time, and she's weeping. And she sees a man whom she thinks is the gardener. This is a tomb in a garden. And she says, "If you have taken the body of my Lord, tell me where you have laid him." And Christ speaks to her. He says, "Mary." And she recognizes him, and she, because she didn't expect to see him alive, and she recognizes him, and she reaches out to touch him. She can't believe it. And he says, "Touch me not, noli me tangere. I have not yet ascended to the Father." Now, we're assuming that this picture, which is, it's a reasonable size. It's 2.5 feet, 31 inches, a little over 2.5 feet high, but it's small enough to be used for personal devotion, and you'd be right up close to Mary and Christ, and certainly would elicit an emotional response. I mean, that moment when Mary realizes that Christ is still alive. Just what an amazing experience. So it is certainly trying to elicit an emotional response, and this is just very appropriate for devotions, including Counter-Reformation devotions. Remember, the Counter-Reformation decorum says things have to be the way they are in Scripture. Or it could be Scripture interpreted perhaps by fathers of the church or something, but it should be quite decorous. And you have that here. In the background, you see sunrise, daybreak, far in the distance. You have this lovely little landscape, which is suggesting, that this is the morning of the resurrection. And then you see in the middle ground, off to our left, the first coming of the Marys to the tomb when they're being told that Christ has risen by the angel, but evidently Mary Magdalene's not among them. And then the first time that anyone sees the resurrected Christ is Mary Magdalene, according to the Gospel of St. John. Mary Magdalene is the first person to see Christ after he has risen from the dead. And so that's what you're seeing in the foreground. Now, she really does follow the gospel narrative, because I've never seen a picture before where Christ has a gardener's hat and a shovel. And this has to be a reference to the gospel words where Mary mistook Christ for the gardener. So it's kind of spelled out very literally for us here. Just another picture of Christ in the Canaanite woman here. You can see some of the Mannerist elongation, and then very complex architecture and landscape sort of going back into space. Here's another example. Here's an example of one of those large altarpieces, because this one is, what, 83 and 5/8 in height. So it's a large-scale picture. It's St. Francis of Paola blessing a child. It's been suggested that this appeals to Lavinia Fontana's target audience, that I don't know that they know what the commission exactly came from, who it was from, but they know where it was. It was in a chapel in a church in Bologna. And it has many, many, many women, as you can see, sort of spilling out here in this sort of tall triangular form, all dressed in beautiful, elegant costumes, wearing jewels. They are a feast for the eye, and certainly something that an aristocratic patron would be interested in and approve of. The child that's being offered, it has been suggested, is the future Francis I of France, King of France. The contrast of these brightly colored costumes, just the rich garb of the women, contrast with the simplicity of the saint in his very dark habit. He's wearing pattens on his feet, holding a staff. The saint is simple, but the aristocratic women are the feast for the eye. So she's satisfying, I guess, everybody here. The proportions, very slender, somewhat small heads on elongated bodies, once again reflect the Mannerist proportions of the time. You also see these elongated proportions in this altarpiece, the consecration of the Virgin. And in some Mannerist works, you not only see these elongated figures, but you also see almost a kind of reversal in scale, where the most important figure is in the background and the lesser figures in the foreground. Well, in this case, that's the young children, the young men who are being consecrated are in the foreground, and certainly, presumably their families want to see their portraits right up front. Mary, however, is not exactly hidden. She's at the top of the picture. She's shown in heaven on clouds with an aureole of light, which was an aureole of angels, as you can see, surrounded by saints and adored by, they may be personifications, or they might be St. Helena and St. Agnes. I'm just judging from the cross and the crown, which would be St. Helena, and the figure who's kneeling and holding a lamb, possibly Agnes, although they could be personifications of something too. It's because I haven't found anything really a lot about the iconography of that. A very tiny little picture, once again, on metal. I guess I'm not sure it's copper or not, so you say on metal. But it's got to be a devotional work, because it's a very small little picture, and it's very precious. It has just beautiful colors. I don't think they're coming out as well in the reproduction. It's just very light. But the brushstrokes here are just very fluid, elegant, lights coming from the windows. You have sort of two windows in the background. And it's another Holy Family where you're having three generations. The Christ child and John the Baptist, and presumably St. Anne, although sometimes I keep wondering if it couldn't be the Baptist mother, St. Elizabeth, but they usually identify these as St. Anne, who would be the grandmother of Christ, Mary's mother, and then, of course, Mary and her husband Joseph, who's back there with a great big book he's reading, and then looking over, sort of, overseeing, making sure everything's fine with his family. The idea of Joseph as, this wonderful saint who watches over his family starts to come into being in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And today, of course, it's very familiar, but sometimes back in the Middle Ages, Joseph was a buffoon, the old man who didn't know how his young wife got pregnant. That's certainly completely gone, and that would not be appropriate for Counter-Reformation devotion or decorum at all. So he has he's in the background, but he's still important. The children are very lively. And you may notice the teeny little feet, especially it looks like the Baptist almost like he's doing a ballet kind of pose with the pointed toes. That's a very Mannerist kind of thing to do. You have these little tapered feet. The object in the background, in the alcove, is what sometimes called a yarn winder or a thread winder. When you're spinning, you have to wind up the threads that she'll make. So this, I've been fascinated with these because they do appear in some pictures of the Virgin, and I'm curious to know if they have any, what their meaning is. Are they just simply a domestic device, because the Virgin is an example of perfect woman who is doing her female domestic work? Or does it have some kind of symbolism? It could symbolize a cross or something like this. But it's just something I'm interested in. If you find any references, do let me know. And here are some of the details. Let's see, that'll perhaps look a little better. Lavinia Fontana, like Sophonis Bagrisola, is very famous for painting portraits, and portraits with rich costume details. This particular young woman, we don't know her name, although I'm getting a suspicion, but we don't know her name. But so she's just called A Portrait of a Young Woman, and they don't have a date on it, so it's approximately 1580. This illustrates the rich costume details, and I will have some details to show you of this. Just marvelous textures of the jewels, of the embroidery, and this sort of strange object, which is hanging from her waist on a chain, is a marten. There was a weasel-like animal, and they would take these. I guess they stuffed them, these pelts, and sometimes they completely encase them in jewelry, and sometimes they just be bejeweled. And it was very fashionable to carry these weasels around on your belt. And to me, it's terribly grotesque. You probably didn't notice it, but in one of the pictures of Queen Isabella, the 3/4 length view, she has one of them too. One of the ideas about this is that it may be a betrothal or wedding portrait. And, why do they think this? Well, one thing is you often have your portrait painted on occasions. And so we have here, the rich garments, which could certainly be part of the trousseau. Before wives married, we hear about the hope chest today, but it's not as much practiced yet now. But it used to be that, these wealthy, noble wives would just have tremendous amount of beautiful garments and furnishings for the house as part of the trousseau and as part of the dowry, in a sense. They bring with them the wealth to their husband. So this is certainly an extremely elaborate garment. Also, red was the color that was often used for Bolognese brides. That would be their wedding dress. You didn't have a dress that you only wore on your wedding, of course. It would continue to be your very, very good dress. And then, of course, a dog. It may just be that the sitter wanted her little pet in the picture. But also the dog was a symbol of marital fidelity, particularly associated with the women, because they didn't think it was as important for the men to be faithful. But women very often have pictures of dogs as a symbol of faith. And if you think about the dogs, the traditional dog name is Fido, which means I am faithful. And here you can look at some of the details of the jewels and the clothing and the way light shines on them. Just extremely rich. And there is that, I would never have recognized it if I hadn't read about it. There is the bejeweled marten and beautiful embroidery on the sleeves and the skirt, and the little dog as well. Lavinia Fontana did not just paint women, she also did portraits of men. Okay, this is a portrait of Girolamo Mercuriale, who is a professor of medical theory at the University of Bologna. And he's shown in his library, he's showing us an open anatomy book. Now this is an actual book, so this is a portrait of the book. And the book is a very famous medical text, Andrea Vesalio's De Humani Corpus Fabrica, or about the fabric, the composition of the human body. And this is one of the most famous early medical texts by somebody who actually dissected bodies. Just, you know, as I say, it's a very famous, well-known book. I actually had a student who wrote one of his term papers for my Italian Renaissance class on the pictures in the book, some of them anyway. Now, we see one of the pages, and you see this skeleton in a very naturalistic position, which is one of the things they sometimes do in Renaissance art. And, you know, you think of Hamlet, you know, the skull of Yorick or something, because he's leaning on his arms and he's contemplating the skull. So I guess maybe a little bit ironic, the skeleton is contemplating the skull. I've read that this suggests that the sitter is melancholic, but it seems to me a little more obvious that there is a moral message here. You know, he's pointing out, you know, he has all this anatomical knowledge, he's got a medical book, but the page that he's chosen is the skeleton itself, death itself, is thinking about death, the brevity of human life. So this little moral message as well. We said she appealed to female sitters because, you know, it was perfectly proper to have a woman artist portray you, and of course she was very, very good at portraying all of these stuffs and embroidery and details. And here we even have a lovely little still life with vessel and clear vessel and flowers. Portrait of Costanza Alidossi. Now, she was someone who was famed for her beauty and her virtue. There was poetry written to her. But it has been suggested that the purpose of this painting is not just to show her beauty and her wealth, although that's certainly the wealth is there, but her power. And she is one of these women whose husband gave her a power of attorney. He gave her the power to conduct business in his absence. So this meant that, you know, she was, obviously she was trusted by her husband, but she obviously had business acumen too. So we see her social status, we see her power, and we see, you know, just this portrait of a woman who is in luxurious circumstances. You'll notice that she also has her little dog. Lap dogs are fashionable, and they may refer to the virtue, the fidelity of the wife. The pose is kind of interesting too, because it looks like she's almost ready to get up. She's kind of pressing her hand against the armrest, and it gives it a much more dynamic quality, I think. I can't think, you know, it's a little unusual to see that in portraits of the time. This is a beautiful portrait. This is in Baltimore, and it's a portrait of, they've done, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but they've done some reconstruction about where the provenance was, and they think that it's a portrait of Ginevra Aldrovandi Hercolani as a widow. Incidentally, if on identifications, if you can't remember the name of the whole woman, you know, you can say a portrait of a widow, or a portrait of a woman, or a portrait of the Queen of Spain, or something like that. Yes, people who are queens, you should probably know who they are. But I won't require that you know who everybody is in all of these different portraits. So I don't even know whether they've got on the tag in the museum, actually. I don't remember. But as I say, they believe they've identified the sitter. And she's dressed, as you can see, all in black. And she has a somewhat melancholy facial expression. It's a very serious facial expression. The pose, the detailed clothing are you know, very decorous. And here we're getting into decorum just as social decorum, not religious decorum. And appropriate for a wealthy widow. And the dog, of course, could represent not only her favorite little lap dog, but also the symbol of her marital fidelity. You may just notice that all these little dogs look about alike, which makes you wonder if they were real dogs or they were just symbols. I don't know. One of the things that was mentioned in some of the things that I was reading about this was that although, you know, you could have had a very stiff pose here, there's just little details, and they mention specifically, you can see here the earring drop. Instead of hanging straight down, it sort of bends and nestles against this very elaborate lace ruff. So she's just little details to make her less stiff, little things of naturalism, you know, exactly what would happen to a drop earring. Well, that's what would happen. So that, that combination of Mannerist elegance and the naturalistic detail is part and parcel of Lavinia Fontana's style. She also painted a Judith. We're going to find that Judith is a fairly popular subject in the history of art, and seems to be something that certain women artists paint. We'll see more later. That's why I said she also. I should go back and just read that because I'm thinking ahead. Lavinia Fontana painted a picture of Judith with the head of Holofernes, and we're going to find out that this is a very popular subject in the history of art, and also a popular subject with some women artists, particularly we'll see in the 1600s, and this is dated 1600. It is signed and dated, and it has been suggested that either Judith or maybe even Judith and her maidservants could be portraits in the guise of biblical heroines. One of the things that interests me, to be perfectly frank, was when I was looking at this, my pictures of several books were open, and tell me if I'm wrong, go back and look at that young woman who is in her possible wedding garment. Could these possibly be the same person? The hairline is certainly the same. The features are very, very similar. Nobody's ever suggested that. That's just, something, it may not be true. But I just wondered, maybe, that's why I said maybe, this might be her at a later date. And you can see that because of provenance, this has been known to be in the collection of the Bargellini family from early years of the 20th century, and they suspect that it might have been in the Bargellini collection, since its creation. So they looked back at people who might have owned it, and one idea was that this could be a portrait of Costanza Bianchetti, the widow of Galeazzo Bargellini. And he died in 1596. So, this could be a few years after that. Why Judith and Holofernes? Well, the story of Judith, which I will be telling you in some more detail later, but Judith in the Bible is the subject of the book of Judith. She is a virtuous widow who saves her people from the Assyrian army by killing their general, Holofernes. So she is considered to be, in Christian lore, she is often considered to be a type for things, well, kind of allegorically, virtue defeating vice, or chastity overcoming lust, good things defeating bad things, essentially, and also as one of the strong women of the Bible. Since Judith is a virtuous widow, that may have been the idea for a possible portrait in the guise of a biblical heroine. Now, all of that, of course, there's a lot of assumptions going on, but it's a kind of interesting idea. What do we see stylistically? The rich color of the garments. We've got this very dramatic lighting. Tenebrism was very, very popular at the time. We're not really seeing where the light's coming from. There's no candle. It's just sort of illuminating Judith, and then in the background a little bit of the maidservant. She's showing that she can do this very skillfully. So she's Lavinia Fontana is a virtuoso, showing what they sometimes call a torchlight scene. And I just put this in because I liked it. It's a drawing of a head of a boy. It's been attributed to Lavinia Fontana, and I just think it's a very lively piece, and just shows some of her naturalism with the figure just looking over the shoulder, and it gives it a lot more lively appearance than if it was sort of just figure straight on. That was interesting. She also painted some classical nudes. And I know one of the authors mentioned, they said they wondered whether some of these people knew about it or not, because it seemed like such a difference between her very decorous religious paintings. And it has been suggested that some of these nudes have a certain erotic flavor to them. I didn't show you the one that's definitely does because I don't have a decent picture of it. Just a little teeny picture. But we're going to look at two pictures of Minerva, the virgin goddess of wisdom, who is in the process of getting dressed. And there's two versions of this. This is the one that's in the Borghese Gallery in Rome. It's a full-length figure, and you're seeing Minerva dressing. You're seeing her in the nude from the back, and she looks like she could be in a Renaissance palazzo or the Villa Borghese or something like that, with these very rich clothing that she's picking up on. And you see her shield, I think her helmet there on the floor. She's taken those off, discarded them. Fontana's anatomy of the nude, I'm trying to think of a nice word to say it. Let's just say I think it's lacking. And I think that's very normal. She can't study from the nude. So anything that she is doing, she has to look at classical statues or something or other people's artwork. So they're very idealized, very smoothed over. You know, she's not showing you where every muscle is. The interesting thing about this is it was commissioned by the Cardinal Scipione Borghese. And we mentioned that he was one of her patrons. And that's why it's in the Borghese Gallery today. Here's another version of it. It's a close-up version. It's today in a private collection. It's also quite a large piece, though. It was in this exhibition that I saw. And it's a close-up, and it's been suggested that this one may actually be a portrait of somebody. Once again, you know, we don't know, so I put a little question mark. Close-up, possibly, a close-up allegory, possibly a portrait. One of the things that was said about it was that this idea of Minerva dressing was an emblem that was often used in the Prague court of Rudolph II. And she was called Minerva Pacifera, Minerva, bringer of peace. Now, they didn't explain how this worked. So, you know, I had to sort of look at it and say, okay, what's going on? You don't think of Minerva as being in the nude except at the Judgment of Paris. Because she's a virgin goddess, she's a warrior goddess, she's the patron of everybody from scholars to warriors to craftsmen. But one of the things, of course, is she has taken off, she has discarded her armor, and she's picking up this very luxurious cloak. So I'm wondering if that is where the symbolism comes in, that she's set aside her armor, and she's picking up a dress for peace, that she can wear in a peaceful time.